and I gave you my personal answer as a member of the minority. The committee can do that. That falls within my amendment. But I'm putting forth this amendment because what I see happening right now is the same thing that we see in authoritarian dictatorships, is the same thing that we saw King George do to colonists, and that is if a member of the press has the temerity to disagree with the president, to criticize the president, or say something he does not like, he threatens to take their license away, or the FCC threatens action to punish them. And if we continue seeing that and it gets worse, then yes, I think this committee should do something about it. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. Mr. Chairman.
That's fine. You want it? That's fine. I appreciate the response. However, I, again, go back to, we've just witnessed 4 years of weaponization of every single federal agency, including the explosive practice of switchboarding, in which we saw federal agencies, including the Biden FCC, put incredible pressure on private entities to comply with wholly unconstitutional, blatant violations of the First Amendment, and you had nothing to say about it.
Mr. Chair,
No, I do not yield.
Okay.
So, the hypocrisy, once again, is shining bright and clear. The American people have absolutely spoken out loud and clear. They are sick and tired of the weaponization of government. This committee is serious about the oversight capabilities that we have and we will exercise.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Trahan.
I move to strike the last word. I'm not sure if in oversight, the subcommittee chose to bring a hearing for what you just described as weaponization of every single agency by the Biden administration. But do I need to remind you all that you're in the majority? You could have done that. You could have actually called that hearing. We can't do it. I wish we could. We will soon. I yield my time to the gentlelady from Virginia.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, actually, Ms. Trahan made my point, but I want to reiterate it. For the last 2 years, you were in the majority and could have had whatever oversight hearing you wanted. I wasn't here before 2023, so I can't speak to what happened, whether or why it did. But here's what I did do. I sat in the rotunda and heard the President of the United States say there will be no more weaponization of federal government agencies. Was that a lie? What I have noticed in my short time in Congress is many of the accusations made by Republicans are confessions. And so what I see happening is a president and his whatever Elon Musk is moving to take control of as much of the federal government as they can, moving to take control of our military leadership, moving to take control of the press in whatever form that it is, so that they can push out their propaganda, so that they can quash dissent. And that is authoritarian, leading to dictatorship. That is exactly what George Mason warned against when he wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which I quoted earlier today. And I'm here to say, I'm not going to stay quiet about it. I yield back.
I yield my time to the gentlelady from New York.
Thank you. You know, just because we say things or a person says something doesn't mean that it's true. And I've heard a lot of things about weaponization of every agency, even the example on FBI and the Twitter files. I served as the vice-ranking member for the Oversight Committee the entire last term. And all of these examples that are being provided went through the Oversight Committee investigation, and it was nothing burger after nothing burger, led by James Comer, whiffing week after week on this stuff. This idea that the FBI, I know they say things, but we actually went through. It would be concerning, wouldn't it? It would be concerning. These examples, genuinely, please, because after a year, James Comer could not procure a single example of the FBI forcing Twitter's action. In fact, Twitter's own lawyers said in court, in their own testimony, as a company that was alleged, that people are alleging was so-called force, their own lawyers said that they were never coerced or made by the FBI to do anything at all, in court, in front of a judge. And so, I mean, when we talk about the First Amendment, I'm curious as to what my colleagues feel about this administration having their own acting directors of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, for example, going on Fox News, threatening sitting members of Congress, myself, opening a Department of Justice investigation because I shared people's constitutional rights with my constituents. Where's the free speech verdict on that? I'm gonna get locked up for it? If y'all do it, you better throw away the key, I'll tell you that much. But genuinely, this idea that the majority Republicans are the bastions of free speech, eliminating the White House press corps today and their independence, and the President of the United States saying, I'm only gonna pick the journalists that cover me, or whatever Twitter accounts that they favor the most now. I mean, let's dispense with this, folks. This is enough. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it's not quite going to be 6 weeks. I understand that they're not going to present all of the other side is not going to present all their amendments. I'm sitting here with, prepared for another 30, but I hear that's not going to happen. I will say this on this amendment, though, and this is where we've been the whole day. The document that we're dealing with covers all kinds of things in very general terms so that it is available to this committee to investigate what it needs to investigate. And we've gone down rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole on specifics and details. Didn't need to happen, but here we are. And it's a part of the process. If the other side wants to bring all these issues up, we can. But let me make clear on the freedom of speech that I feel very strongly about freedom of speech. I would submit, and I know the gentlelady from Virginia, who's my former colleague in the Virginia House of Delegates, knows some of this, but she referenced the Federalist Papers, and then she referenced George III. I'm going to reference George III and John Wilkes. I am probably the only member of Congress who has a caricature of John Wilkes on the wall in his office. Now, some of you are going, John Wilkes? Who in the heck is that? John Wilkes was a rabble-rouser in London, and he wrote a newspaper called the North Briton. And he made a reference in North Briton 45 to the Earl of Bute, who was a North Briton. He was from Scotland and might have participated in the revolution of 45 or the rebellion of 45 by Bonnie Prince Charlie. And so he was making a slam on the Earl of Bute, who would be what we would call today the Prime Minister, and George III in attacking those policies. He would later be arrested or attempted to be arrested, and the courts determined that because he was a member of Parliament at the time that he was writing these salacious things about the king and the Earl of Bute, he could not be prosecuted. He was in touch with the Sons of Liberty and thus is the basis of the freedom of speech. And I could get into general warrants, but that's not the subject of this amendment. But he was also the basis. The Wilkesite Rebellion of the 1760s was also the basis for our prohibition against general warrants, him and Mr. Otis. So just so that everybody knows, both sides of the aisle care about this issue. We just think that the document we currently have would allow us to have plenty of debate on this in our various subcommittees without us having to have been here for 12 or 13 hours. I yield back. I yield to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer.
I just want to point out some real examples of political censorship and intimidation. In February of 21, 2 House Democrats urged cable, satellite, and internet programming distributors to drop Fox News, Newsmax, and One American News. In April of 21, the Biden administration met with Twitter to advocate that conservative users be shut down. In July of 21, the White House confirmed that it was in regular touch with social media companies about monitoring content it deemed disinformation. I could go on, demanding that big tech companies, this is March 22, hand over information about how many social media users. I could go on with this. The interesting thing is in this committee, in a markup, a resolution of inquiry, a resolution of inquiry was marked up in the Energy and Commerce Committee. It was introduced by my friend Buddy Carter that would have forced the FCC to disclose any documents that detail politically motivated censorship, whether it was deplatforming, other examples of censorship, and every Democrat on this committee voted against it. Every one of you voted against it. It's just interesting to me that all of a sudden now you're concerned about political censorship. I yield back.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Is there any additional discussion on the amendment? If there is no further discussion, the ranking member is requesting a roll call. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Hudson.
No.
Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Carter of Georgia. Mr. Carter of Georgia votes no. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn votes no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce votes no. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes no. Mr. Fulcher. Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Pfluger. Mr. Pfluger votes no. Mrs. Harshbarger. Mrs. Harshbarger votes no. Mrs. Miller-Meeks. Mrs. Miller-Meeks votes no. Mrs. Kamick. Mrs. Kamick votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes no. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes no. Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry votes no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Langworthy. Mr. Langworthy votes no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane votes no. Mr. Ruley. Mr. Ruley votes no. Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Goldman. Mr. Goldman votes no. Ms. Fedorchak. Mrs. Fedorchak votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mrs. Dingell. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes aye. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Barragan. Ms. Barragan votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes aye. Ms. Schreier. Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Trahan. Ms. Trahan votes aye. Ms. Fletcher. Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Landsman. Ms. McClellan. Ms. McClellan votes aye. Chairman Guthrie. Chairman Guthrie votes no.
Has everyone been recorded? Does anyone seek recognition? The clerk will report the result.
Chairman Joyce, on that vote, there were 19 ayes and 29 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments? For what purpose does Ms. Trahan seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment. Which amendment is that, Ms. Trahan?
HE 12.
Amendment to draft oversight plan, HE 12.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am offering this amendment to make it clear that this committee has a responsibility to provide oversight of Medicare's drug pricing negotiation to ensure that Americans are getting the best deal possible on their prescription medication. Now, I know that my colleagues are put out and maybe even a bit annoyed by these amendments, but these are important debates. These are debates that our constituents want us to have because the times that we find ourselves living in are dramatically different than when we adopted the committee's oversight plan last Congress. Now, because of the Inflation Reduction Act, Medicare finally has the power to negotiate drug prices on behalf of American patients, a long overdue common sense policy that people across the country overwhelmingly support and saves our government money. For too long, pharmaceutical companies dictated prices with no accountability, forcing seniors and hardworking families to pay exorbitant costs for life-saving medications. Now, the largest pharmaceutical customer in the country, Medicare, can leverage its bargaining power to secure lower drug prices, just like private insurers and other countries have done for years, and pass those savings on to American taxpayers. This is what the American people have been demanding because they're tired of choosing between putting food on the table, heating their homes, and affording the medications that they need to survive. Now it's up to Congress to build on this progress, to not only ensure that we're lowering drug prices, and that remains our priority, but that we're expanding the portfolio of drugs being negotiated so that more people see more savings when they're at the pharmacy counter. Our focus must be on lowering healthcare costs and expanding access to affordable medications, not rolling back or walking away from policies that finally put patients first. This is a moment to listen to the American people and make sure Medicare's ability to negotiate remains strong so that no one is forced to make the impossible decision between their health and their financial security. The Inflation Reduction Act's Medicare price negotiation, inflation rebates, and out-of-pocket caps are already driving down costs for seniors. But we must ensure that these policies are implemented effectively and deliver the savings patients deserve. Strong oversight by this committee will also help identify opportunities to expand these benefits to more Americans, including those with private insurance, so everyone can access affordable medications. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Anyone seeking recognition for discussion? Gentleman from Georgia, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I speak in opposition to the amendment. Since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, or the Biden and Congressional Democrats' drug pricing control scheme, seniors have seen fewer choices in affordable prescription medications and skyrocketing premiums. It's also anticipated seniors will have less access to innovative and life-saving drugs. In 2024, year-over-year Medicare Part D premiums jumped by over 20%, while the number of plans that exited the Part D program decreased by more than 10%. In some areas, such as California, individual plan premiums jumped by almost 60%. More consequentially, the law has already had chilling effects on research and development of new therapies. Mr. Chairman, I have said, and I continue to say, and please hear me clearly, in 10 years in the Georgia State Legislature and 10 years in Congress, this is the worst legislation I have ever seen. More consequently, the law has already had chilling effects on research and development of new therapies. Since the law's passing, In August of 2022, there have already been 40 research programs discontinued and 22 drugs canceled. In oncology alone, 6 drugs have already been discontinued, coupled with cuts to several research programs. The evidence is clear that price controls don't work and have drastic consequences and only hurt patients. Extending these policies to commercial markets will further exacerbate the challenges created by the IRA that only lead to continued price increases for patients at the drug counter. It will also lead to patient delays in receiving life-saving care and overall reductions in access to life-preserving and life-saving medications. We've already made bipartisan solutions to hold pharmacy middlemen, PBMs, accountable and increasing transparency. We can and we should work to ensure these policies become law in addition to pursuing bipartisan market-based policy solutions that will lower costs without sacrificing life-saving innovations. This amendment does nothing to accomplish either of these, and I urge members to vote no. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Gentleman from Florida, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I yield to the gentlelady from Washington.
I just was listening to this conversation about drug pricing, what our patients want, what have been great decisions. And I will tell you that what I hear from my constituents is that $35 insulin has been a lifesaver. I get thank yous all the time, and I don't believe a one of you voted for that. I'm going to now yield to my colleague, Lori Trahan from Massachusetts.
Thank you. I just happy to get so many things out on the record today, because I think if I go back the 12 hours when we started, I heard we're gutting Medicare to the tune of nearly $1 trillion. And now we're going to roll back the savings that we have passed on to patients who need life-saving medication. So they can expect their $35 insulin to go back up. Medicare will stop negotiating drug prices so that they can afford their medicine at the life-saving counter, and there will be no expanded portfolio or more people who will get the benefit of affordable prescriptions. That's great. That gives me all I need, not only to, that gives me all I need. Thank you.
And I reclaim the time on the night where we saw a vote to cut $880 billion from Medicaid. You're going to attack the IRA. I find that to be very interesting.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back.
Gentleman yields back.
Gentleman from Alabama, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Mr. Chairman, again, let me explain. $35 copay on insulin is great for patients, but it does nothing for the cost of the drug. It still continues to go up. It is not going to address the cost of the drug to the insurance company and ultimately to the patient. Yes, if we can cap copay, Mr. Chairman, I'm reclaiming my time. Again, a $35 copayment is great, but it does nothing for the cost of the drug. The drug continues to go up, and that's not the problem. The problem is the middleman, the PBMs, that are causing the drugs to go up. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back to gentleman from Alabama.
I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion? Gentleman from Massachusetts.
The gentleman from Georgia makes a good point that the pharmacy benefit managers play a massively distorting role as the middlemen of drug pricing, and they have caused the drug list prices to inflate to the detriment of the people who pay copays based on that list price, which is why it is so disappointing that we were within 12 hours of passing bipartisan PBM reform at the end of last Congress, that the gentleman from Georgia worked so hard and so diligently to get to the finish line. And then Elon Musk tweeted one mean thing about it. And Speaker Johnson flinched. The health insurance lobby flexed, and Speaker Johnson got scared. Let's hope that Speaker Johnson doesn't get scared this time around and actually works to lower healthcare prices for Americans, not just prescription drugs, but also the care for at-home care for seniors, for perinatal care for new mothers by not cutting Medicaid. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Gentlelady from Washington.
I'll just note, and as somebody with type 1 diabetes who relies on insulin, I heard from my endocrinologist that when we dropped insulin prices to $35 a month for seniors, the insulin-making companies independently dropped prices for each one of each type of insulin, long-acting, short-acting, you name it, so that the out-of-pocket cost to consumers would be $35. They saw the writing on the wall that we were coming after them, and they made those changes. So yes, it did change the price of those medicines, and it does save lives.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion? Seeing none. The vote occurs on the amendment. The gentleman from New Jersey requested a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Hudson?
No.
Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Carter of Georgia? Mr. Carter of Georgia votes no. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Dunn? Mr. Dunn? Mr. Dunn votes no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce votes no. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Balderson? Mr. Balderson votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Pfluger? Mr. Pfluger votes no. Mrs. Harshbarger? Mrs. Harshbarger votes no. Mrs. Miller-Meeks? Mrs. Miller-Meeks votes no. Mrs. Kamick? Mrs. Kamick votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes no. Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mrs. Houchin? Mrs. Houchin votes no. Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Langworthy? Mr. Langworthy votes no. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane votes no. Mr. Ruley? Mr. Ruley votes no. Mr. Evans? Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Goldman? Mr. Goldman votes no. Mrs. Fedorchak? Mrs. Fedorchak votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mrs. Dingell? Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes aye. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Barragan? Ms. Barragan votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Trahan? Ms. Trahan votes aye. Ms. Fletcher? Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss? Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana? Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Landsman? Mr. Landsman votes aye. Ms. McClellan? Ms. McClellan votes aye. Chairman Guthrie? Chairman Guthrie votes no.
Anyone seeking to answer the roll call? Seeing no one seeking to answer the roll call, the clerk will report.
Chairman Guthrie, on that vote, there were 20 ayes and 29 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, to present Amendment HE 14.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to Draft Oversight Plan, HE 14.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I care about affordable health coverage for all Americans, both my constituents and yours. And so this amendment is continuing on that theme, but this time with the ACA, making sure that the health coverage continues to be affordable. You know, in Florida, a lot of people may be surprised to know we have the largest Obamacare exchange in the nation. 4.6 million Floridians get their health care, private insurance through the Affordable Care Act exchange. Texas and California also have giant Obamacare exchanges. In my district, we have the second most in the nation, and the top 5 are all in Florida. 237,000 people getting their health care through the Obamacare exchange. And in 2021, we passed the premium tax credit. It was a smashing success. We saw people save thousands of dollars, and many, many more people in places like Florida and Texas and California end up getting private health care and lowering the uninsured rate. But this is the thing, this premium could go away. This premium tax credit could go away if we don't extend it before the end of the year. In fact, millions of Americans will see their new rates come out in May if Congress does nothing, which is why it's of critical importance as we see the CR coming up, because the bill's gonna come due, and it's gonna be huge for folks. I was looking at the Kaiser Family Foundation's calculator, and a family of four, middle class, upper middle class, making about $100,000 to $125,000 a year, they could expect a $13,000 increase in their payments. And if we're talking about now with Medicaid in Florida, if we see these drastic cuts of $880 billion, and that affects our CHIP program, where we have 2.4 million children on kid care, well, that also, now people are gonna have to get both those, in a family of four, 2 kids insured. That's another 8 to 10 grand. And so when you look at, we're talking about 8 to 10 to 12 grand per family in increases that we could see before the end of the year, and the bill comes due. It ends up being about $20,000 or $30,000 for health insurance for a family of four. And then it gets even worse with nursing homes, because it's about 30 to 50 grand to pay for a grandma who no longer is getting covered by Medicaid to make sure that she's covered in a nursing home. And inflation is one of the top issues, if not the top issue. So I would imagine 8 to 12 grand more that folks are going to be paying every year is going to be something that they're going to notice. We don't want the bill to come due for Florida families in May or for any other families. And so this is another fork in the road. We have an oversight plan where we could do something about it, or it could be ignored, but the bill's still coming due. And so I hope I can get your support, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any discussion? Seeing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. A roll call vote has been requested by the gentleman from New Jersey. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Hudson.
No.
Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Carter of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Carter of Georgia votes no. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn votes no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce votes no. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Allen. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes no. Mr. Fulcher. Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Pfluger. Mr. Pfluger votes no. Mrs. Harshbarger. Mrs. Harshbarger votes no. Mrs. Miller-Meeks. Mrs. Miller-Meeks votes no. Mrs. Kamick. Mrs. Kamick votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes no. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes no. Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry votes no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Langworthy. Mr. Langworthy votes no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane votes no. Mr. Ruley. Mr. Ruley votes no. Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Goldman. Mr. Goldman votes no. Mrs. Fedorchak. Mrs. Fedorchak votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mrs. Dingell. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes aye. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Barragan. Ms. Barragan votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes aye. Ms. Schreier. Ms. Schreier votes aye. Mr. Han. Mr. Han votes aye. Ms. Fletcher. Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Landsman. Mr. Landsman votes aye. Ms. McClellan. Ms. McClellan votes aye. Chairman Guthrie. Chairman Guthrie votes no.
Is anyone seeking to answer the roll call? Seeing none, the clerk will report. Oh, excuse me, the clerk has a report. Yes, so how's Mr. Allen reported?
Mr. Allen is not recorded. Mr. Allen votes no.
The clerk will report. guess until they report it. Floor is open.
Chairman Guthrie, on that vote, there were 20 ayes and 29 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Washington have an amendment?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment titled HE 26.
Clerk will report.
Amendment to Draft Oversight Plan, HE 26.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a pediatrician and a member of Congress, I am always laser focused on the health, safety, and well-being of children and their families. Measles is one of the most contagious diseases known. And thanks to widespread vaccination, it was declared eradicated in the United States over 20 years ago. Now, fast forward to now, 2025, and measles has infected over 100 people in Texas and New Mexico just in this past week. A majority of those cases are children, nearly all are unvaccinated. 20% have been hospitalized, and you know what? All of these could have been prevented. Make no mistake, this measles outbreak is the direct consequence of baseless anti-vaccine rhetoric, much of which has been propagated for decades by our Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., confirmed this month by Republican senators, knowing full well what they were getting into. This kind of vaccine misinformation and doubt spread by Mr. Kennedy is beyond irresponsible. It is reckless. He continues to question settled science and scare parents, some of whom choose not to immunize their children, putting their children and others at risk for diseases that are absolutely preventable. I expressed serious concerns with his nomination to lead an agency that is charged with protecting our nation's health and making decisions based on sound science. And now that he is in, I believe it is time to hold him accountable to that mission. And my amendment mandates that this committee summon Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to appear in person and to testify every time there is an outbreak of more than 3 cases of vaccine-preventable illnesses, including but not limited to measles, mumps, meningitis, pertussis, polio, and varicella. His Senate confirmation for this position was a travesty. It was an embarrassment. Sadly, there will be tragic consequences to this, and he needs to be held accountable by answering to us here in this committee. I encourage all of my colleagues to vote yes on accountability, and I yield back.
Is there a discussion on the amendment? Gentleman from Georgia, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I move to speak in opposition to the amendment. The committee's oversight plan clearly states that the committee will conduct broad oversight over CDC. The oversight plan already includes broad public health oversight, so this amendment is unnecessary, and although I might add, it's perhaps the most detailed amendment I've ever heard, and I'm very impressed, I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Gentlelady from Massachusetts.
I move to strike the last word in support of this amendment.
Recognized.
Thank you. The head health director should be a trusted source of science-based information, someone the public can rely on during health crises. Instead, he has played a significant role in fueling vaccine conspiracy theories. Given the dangers of this disinformation, it's essential to call him in whenever a preventable disease outbreak occurs. And I really do credit my colleague from Washington for the detail in this amendment, because I think it's wholly actionable by our oversight committee. Everyone on this committee should agree that vaccines have saved lives for decades, protecting children and families from deadly diseases and preventing public health crises. The fact that we are still fighting against disinformation about something so fundamental to public health, it's not just frustrating, it's dangerous. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s reckless spread of vaccine disinformation puts lives at risk, sowing distrust in proven science and endangering communities. And you don't have to take my word for it or my colleague's word for it. Look at the consequences of RFK Jr.'s actions in Samoa. His dubiously titled anti-vaccine organization, the Children's Health Defense, had spent years amplifying discredited lies about vaccines, including the measles vaccine. When he visited the island nation in 2019, he did so with the goal of scaring parents away from the vaccine. Months later, a measles outbreak swept across the nation, infecting thousands and killing 83 individuals, almost all of whom were small children. That could happen in our country, and I think it would be responsible of the committee that if it does, he has to sit at that table and answer for it. To this day, Mr. Kennedy has refused any accountability for those tragic, preventable deaths, including during his testimony before the Senate just weeks ago when he said, quote, "We don't know what was killing them," end quote. That's a lie, and it's one that was called out by Samoa's Director General. You know, as a mother, I know I'm not alone here. Most of us have children. We would do anything to protect our kids. Every parent should have the confidence that when they take their child to the doctor, they are making the safest, most informed decision possible, not one clouded by conspiracy theories and political opportunism. The politicization of vaccines is costing lives, and we cannot allow anyone, especially the HHS secretary, to undermine decades of medical progress. The stakes are too high. We must stand up to disinformation and ensure that every family has access to the truth. Vaccines save lives, and spreading lies about them has deadly consequences. Mr. Kennedy must be held accountable by this committee and required to answer for his role in spreading misinformation when a preventable outbreak occurs on his watch. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment. The gentleman from New Jersey has requested a recorded vote, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis? No. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Hudson?
No.
Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Carter of Georgia? Mr. Carter of Georgia votes no. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Dunn? Mr. Dunn votes no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce votes no. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Balderson? Mr. Balderson votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Pfluger? Mr. Pfluger votes no. Mrs. Harshbarger? Mrs. Harshbarger votes no. Mrs. Miller-Meeks? Mrs. Miller-Meeks votes no. Mrs. Kamick? Mrs. Kamick votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes no. Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mrs. Houchin? Mrs. Houchin votes no. Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Langworthy? Mr. Langworthy votes no. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane votes no. Mr. Ruley? Mr. Ruley votes no. Mr. Evans? Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Goldman? Mr. Goldman votes no. Mrs. Fedorchak? Mrs. Fedorchak votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mrs. Dingell? Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes aye. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Bettergan? Ms. Bettergan votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Trahan? Ms. Trahan votes aye. Ms. Fletcher? Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss? Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana? Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Landsman? Mr. Landsman votes aye. Ms. McClellan? Ms. McClellan votes aye. Chairman Guthrie? Chairman Guthrie votes no.
The clerk will, is there anyone seeking recognition to vote on the amendment? Seeing none, the clerk will report.
Chairman Carter, on that vote, there were 19 ayes and 29 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to, so I'll just announce it appears there's one more amendment to be offered, and then we'll also have to vote on the plan, so we should have two more votes. So What purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will, what, do you have the number of the amendment?
It's the Alzheimer's Research/Tonko amendment.
The clerk have that amendment. The clerk will report.
Alzheimer research offered by Mr. Tonko.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My colleagues, my amendment is simple and self-explanatory. It would simply require this committee to examine the impact that the DOGE personnel cuts are having on our federal research efforts to address Alzheimer's disease. Let me be clear. Our federal research enterprise, and in particular Alzheimer's-focused research, are programs that have long been championed by bipartisan members of this committee. I'm indeed proud to have worked with my colleague and our chairman, Mr. Guthrie, on a number of pieces of Alzheimer's legislation over multiple Congresses that have helped inform our federal response on this devastating disease. Chair Guthrie has been a good friend and a steadfast leader in the fight to provide hope to those struggling with an Alzheimer's diagnosis. As the Energy and Commerce Committee, we literally built the federal Alzheimer's research infrastructure together. These are programs that we developed, drafted, and debated right here in this very room. It's the type of serious, sustained, bipartisan work that every member of this committee should be proud of. The programs we have authorized have led to countless breakthroughs that help us better understand Alzheimer's and related dementias, that have given millions across this nation and indeed the world hope that American ingenuity can one day rid the world of this terrible affliction. Again, this is something we should all feel institutional pride for in a bipartisan fashion. This is good work. This is the type of thing that we all come to Congress to accomplish. But at this moment, I don't feel proud. I feel angry, white-hot anger, because instead of supporting American innovation and ingenuity, instead of working to provide hope to families across our nation, unelected bureaucrats, led by Elon Musk, are working at this very moment to tear that hope away. Just last week, it was reported that almost 1/10 of the workers at the NIH's Center for Alzheimer's and Related Dementias, CARD, have been fired by Elon Musk and his DOGE team. Included among the reported cuts was the incoming director for the center, Kendall Van Kuren Jensen, widely recognized as a leading researcher in the field. Her research was particularly impactful on helping to enable early detection of Alzheimer's, one of our best hopes in delivering effective treatments. Furthermore, according to ABC News, one of those fired recently published a first author paper in a high-impact journal, yet we're told they were being fired for poor performance. The outgoing director of CARD, Andrew Singleton, told colleagues in an email that the layoffs would, and I quote, have a profound impact on the work we do to understand and treat this disease. This is not seeking out waste, fraud, or abuse. This is simply a meat cleaver. How am I supposed to explain these cuts to the family in Ballston Spa that I represent, who are looking for any hope for an aging parent who has just received that heartbreaking diagnosis? How do I explain this to our friends living with Parkinson's and other neurological disorders who understand that this research was also their hope? How am I supposed to explain these cuts to researchers at the University of Albany who are at this moment working to develop groundbreaking screening tools to help address early detection? I'll close with a plea to my colleagues. This is not a partisan issue. It's an institutional one. None of you voted to bring this wanton cruelty to Alzheimer's patients, but you can vote today to say with one clear voice that the Energy and Commerce Committee wants to put an end to it. Let's stand up in a bipartisan fashion and put a stop to this utter nonsense. I ask you to support my amendment. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment. I just want to say to my good friend from New York that we have worked diligently together, and a lot of times people, I know all of us are home and talking to different groups of people, they say, why can't you find things to work together on? And the things that we've worked together on just don't make the news at night because we're trying to get things solved and work together. And most of the issues that we work on this committee are similar to the BOLD Act and the Area Support Act and things that we have worked on together in Alzheimer's research. And even today's hearing, and though it's been contentious and we have vast different opinions, we've all been respectful of each other throughout the day. And I appreciate that. I want to tell the whole committee I appreciate that. And I will tell you, we are going to continue. I buried my mother-in-law last year. I know that we have members on this committee who's taking care of their mother. and others that have experienced this, and we're going to continue to work on Alzheimer's. We're going to make sure it goes forward, and the amendment is not needed because I can commit to everyone, I think everybody here, it's not just the human cost of Alzheimer's, what it does to the person that has it, the family, the caretakers of the family, changing your whole life to try to accommodate somebody with it. I've seen it, and so we're going to continue to work on it. But also, it's estimated to cost the government over $1 trillion a year after I think it's 2050. And I was telling someone, I said, this is really going to affect my grandkids. I said, wait, it's my kids. I'll be 84 in 2050. And so it's going to completely put an extra burden on. So I will commit to you, we are going to focus on Alzheimer's research, and I'm looking forward to continuing to working together with you on this.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Chair, but in the meantime, there's a real concern that this time that's going to elapse could set back that research and
I appreciate that.
suffocating the hope. But with that, I yield back.
I appreciate that, and I will yield to the gentleman, so the gentleman from Georgia doesn't need. I will yield back. Is there further discussion? Just a roll call. Seeing none, the vote is on the amendment, a roll call being requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Hudson.
No.
Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Carter of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Carter of Georgia votes no. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn votes no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce votes no. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes no. Mr. Fulcher. Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Pfluger. Mr. Pfluger votes no. Mrs. Harshbarger. Mrs. Harshbarger votes no. Mrs. Miller-Meeks. Mrs. Miller-Meeks votes no. Mrs. Kamick. Mrs. Kamick votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes no. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes no. Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry votes no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Langworthy. Mr. Langworthy votes no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane votes no. Mr. Ruley. Mr. Ruley votes no. Mr. Goldman. Oh, excuse me. Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Goldman. Mr. Goldman votes no. Mrs. Fedorchak. Mrs. Fedorchak votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mrs. Dingell. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes aye. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Bettergon. Ms. Bettergon votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes aye. Ms. Schreier. Ms. Schreier votes aye. Mr. Han. Mr. Han votes aye. Ms. Fletcher. Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Landsman. Mr. Landsman votes aye. Ms. McClellan. Ms. McClellan votes aye. Chairman Guthrie. Chairman Guthrie votes no.
Anyone seeking the roll call? Seeing none, the clerk will report.
Chairman Guthrie, on that vote, there were 19 ayes and 29 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Is there anybody else seeking recognition for amendments? Seeing none, first I want to thank the clerk and the staff at the table, all the staff on both sides of the aisle for their hard work, and for this committee to set the standard. There has been fierce and passionate debate because people have different views on different things. That is exactly why we're here, but it's also been respectful the entire day and is very much appreciated. And now the question now occurs on approving the Committee on Energy, Commerce, Authorization and Oversight Plan for 119th Congress. All those in favor, well, roll call has been requested by the gentleman from New Jersey. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Latta. Aye. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Aye. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis.
Aye.
Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Hudson.
Aye.
Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Carter of Georgia. Mr. Carter of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn votes aye. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce votes aye. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Fulcher. Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Pfluger. Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mrs. Harshbarger. Mrs. Harshbarger votes aye. Mrs. Miller Meeks. Mrs. Miller Meeks votes aye. Mrs. Kamick. Mrs. Kamick votes aye. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. James. Mr. James votes aye. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry votes aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Langworthy. Mr. Langworthy votes aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane votes aye. Mr. Ruley. Mr. Ruley votes aye. Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans votes aye. Mr. Goldman. Mr. Goldman votes aye. Mrs. Fedorchak. Mrs. Fedorchak votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Ms. Deget. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky is off aye and on no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters. Ms. Dingell. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes no. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Bedegan. Ms. Bedegan votes no. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes no. Ms. Schreier. Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Strahan. Ms. Strahan votes no. Ms. Fletcher. Ms. Fletcher votes no. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes no. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Landsman. Mr. Landsman votes no. Ms. McClellan. Ms. McClellan votes no. Chairman Guthrie. Chairman Guthrie votes aye.
Is anyone here to answer the roll call that's not? Seeing none, the clerk will report.
Chairman Guthrie, on that vote, there were 29 ayes and 19 noes.
29 ayes, 19 noes. The Committee on Energy and Commerce Authorization and Oversight Plan for 119th Congress has been adopted. And without objection, staff is authorized to make technical conforming changes to the plan considered by the committee today. So ordered. Without objection, this committee is adjourned.